Listen to the reed flute, how it complains. It narrates a tale of separation. They've cut me, separated me, severed me from the reed bed. And in my lament, you can hear the lament of all men and women. This is what humanity is longing for. This is what humanity seeks. This is the lament of all humans, all men and women, separation from the source, separation from the reed bed. It's like complaining, why is the ocean not a swimming pool? You know, the ocean is the ocean. If you look at the night sky, the stars look disjointed, but there is a harmony.
So then the companion said, then we are very hopeful of a God that laughs. This is a different God. This is a God of laughter and the God of joy and the God of beauty and the God of love.
Maulana says in Divan-e-Shams, خنکان قماربازی که بباخت آنچه بودش. Blessed is that gambler who lost everything that he had, and nothing remained with him except the desire to gamble one more time. So that's the lover of Allah. Gives everything for Allah. Doesn't withhold anything. Because God is one. So you owe everything to Allah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. We're continuing our journey into the life and legacy of Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi. So last week, we talked about two of the mirrors that Maulana found after the disappearance of Hazrat Shams Tabrizi. Maulana found his beloved first in a humble goldsmith in the city of Konya, and that was Sheikh Salahuddin Zarkub. A goldsmith from the city of Konya. Maulana met him in the marketplace of Konya. He was also a disciple of Burhanuddin Muhaqqiq Tirmidhi, who was the mentor of Maulana. And he was not educated in the traditional sense. However, he had a clean heart. He had a white as snow, as Maulana says, دفتر صوفی سواد و حرف نیست جز دل اسپید همچون برف نیست. The book of the Sufi is not ink and letters. The book of the Sufi is a heart that's washed and is cleansed like snow. ساده مردان که دانش ازلی یافتند از کتاب عشق نبی. There are simple men who found the pre-eternal knowledge, the knowledge from the infinite, the knowledge from the timeless, directly from the book of the love of the Prophet ﷺ. It's not a knowledge that's found in books. It's a direct knowledge that shines upon the heart. And Salahuddin Zarkub had such a knowledge. And there were disciples of Maulana who didn't understand that. They would say, why choose this man as your Khalifa? Whereas there are others who are more learned. And Maulana would point them to this. Through knowledge is cleansing your heart. And after the passing of Sheikh Salahuddin Zarkub, so Sheikh Salahuddin Zarkub passed away in Maulana's own lifetime. And before his passing, he asked everyone, come to my funeral joyful and dancing, so that everyone knows that saints, friends of God, embrace their beloved with joy, embrace death with joy. And that's what happened. So his body was accompanied with tambourines and drums and songs and music. Now, after Sheikh Salahuddin Zarkub, Maulana was close to another important figure, and that is Husamuddin Chalabi. So Chalabi is a title, something similar to Sayyidi in Arabic or Wahy in Persian. It's Master Husamuddin, so Husamuddin Chalabi. And his father was in the Akhi, the community, the guilds of and craftsmen and people of different crafts and tradespeople. And After the passing of his father, they accepted him as his leader. But when Husamuddin met Maulana, he led all of them to Maulana. And he said, if you want guidance, true guidance is here. If you want spiritual presence, the true radiance is here with Maulana. And he gave his wealth for this path, such that they say his houses, his land was gone, and then servants come to him and says, there is nothing else left. And he says, sell the furniture in the house. He was so devoted to Maulana. And he was also a great listener. As Maulana says, my words are just like milk in the breast of the soul. And I need someone to suckle. And Husamuddin does exactly that. And this is why it's Husamuddin who inspires Maulana and who asks Maulana, begs Maulana to write the Masnavi. So he asks Maulana, in our circle, we read the poetry of Sana'i. We read the Baghir or Shana'i or Hadiqatul Haqiqa, the Garden of Truth by Sana'i. And we read the poetry of Attar. We read the Conference of the Birds and Ilahi Name, Musibat Name, poetic works of Attar, of Neshabur. Why don't you write poetry in that style? So just like they wrote instructional poetry centered on spirituality, why don't you do the same for our time, for our circle? And Maulana said, so Maulana and Husamuddin had this resonance with each other. Anything that Maulana thought about, Husamuddin would catch a fragrance of that, and the other way around. So Maulana said, I thought about exactly the same thing. And he takes out of his turban the first 18 verses of the Masnavi. And that's how the Masnavi begins. Or in some versions, it's the other way around. Listen to the reed flute, how it complains. It narrates a tale of separation. They've cut me, separated me, severed me from the reed bed. And in my lament, you can hear the lament of all men and women. This is what humanity is longing for. This is what humanity seeks. This is the lament of all humans, all men and women, separation from the source, separation from the reed bed. Yeah, I want a bosom that is also torn by separation, so that I can explain the pains of longing. So those 18 verses of the Masnavi, there are some commentators on the Masnavi who say they function in the Masnavi just like the Fatiha functions in the Quran. In other words, anything that's in the Quran, it's also in the Fatiha. And anything that's in the Masnavi, it's in the first 18 verses. That's in the Nayname. And there are people who say you need to read at the end of the 18 verses of the Masnavi. Maulana says, در نیابد حال پخته هیچ خام پس سخن کوتاه باید والسلام. No one who is raw, no one who is unripe can understand the state of the ripe. So this is not something that can be told through words. It's something that you have to experience yourself. My words should be brief, farewell. And that farewell is followed by 6 books, by thousands of verses. So the commentators say you need to read those 6 books and journey with Maulana. It's not enough to just read. You need to journey. You need to go through that same experience, same flight. And then you come back and read the Masnavi. You come back and read the Nayname of the Masnavi. Then you realize what Maulana was saying. Then you're ripe enough to understand the Nayname. So that began with Husamuddin asking Maulana to write this book for the community. And when at the end of the first book of the Masnavi, Husamuddin's wife passed away, and Husamuddin was in grief. He couldn't even hold the pen. And Maulana stopped the Masnavi during that time. And he said, چون به معراج حقایق رفته بود بی بهارش غنچه هانش خفته بود. Because Husamuddin was not here. And he had gone to an ascent, he had gone to an ascension. But without his spring, without the spring that is Husamuddin, all the buds could not open, the buds of the Masnavi. Sa'ed Shah maskane in Bad. May the forearm of the king be the resting place of this falcon. And that falcon is Husamuddin. So Husamuddin is a falcon, but he should stay by my side. Ta abad, and may this door of mercy in Dar Rahmat, may this door of mercy be open to humankind forever. So this door of mercy is, of course, the Masnavi. So Maulana's asking Husamuddin to stay so that the Masnavi can continue. Ey Ziya'ul Haq Husamuddin toyi ke gozasht az mah be nurat Masnavi. O Husamuddin, you are the one whose light, because of your radiance, Masnavi is so luminous. Your aspiration is taking this to where only God knows where. So we should not underestimate the role of Husamuddin. So it's your aspiration, it's your lofty spirit that's taking this Masnavi to God knows where. So we need to understand the Masnavi was not a book that was written in behind a desk in a quiet room. Masnavi is a book of Sohbet. It was born in Sohbet. It was written in Sohbet with people like Husamuddin and others. So just like we owe the Masnavi to Maulana, and we're grateful to Maulana for the Masnavi and for Fihi Ma Fihi and for Divan-e-Shams, we need to be grateful for these people as well, to these people as well. And this is why Maulana keeps mentioning Husamuddin in every book of the Masnavi, in the first Dibache, in the introduction, and in the Arabic introduction to the whole Masnavi, Maulana praises Husamuddin. And Faridun Sapah Salar, who is a biographer of Maulana, he says, when Maulana talked about Husamuddin, people got confused. They thought Husamuddin was Maulana's master because of how much respect he had for Husamuddin. And it is true. If you read how Maulana praises Husamuddin, even in the Arabic introduction to the Masnavi, Sayyidi wa Sanadi, he's my master and he's my pillar. Wa makan al-ruh min jasadi, and he's just like my soul. Just like I'm a body and he's my soul. When you read that, it is as if it's a disciple talking about his master, whereas it's the other way around. And ultimately, these people were mirrors. Maulana saw the infinite in them. People would tell Salahuddin Zarkub, this is what Maulana says about you. This is how he praises you. And he would say, this is because I am a mirror and he sees himself in me. He sees his own radiance, his own light in me. But ultimately, they were both mirrors. So Maulana was a mirror and Sheikh Salahuddin was a mirror. And when you put two mirrors facing each other, you see the infinite. And they saw the infinite in each other. And that's what happens in the Sohbet of pure people, people who've cleansed their hearts. They see the infinite. They see the beginning less and the end less in each other.
Just wanted to say regarding this Sheikh Husamuddin Chalabi's act of actually giving up everything and then for Mawla, I mean, all this money and everything else. So this reminded of Hazrat Abu Bakr Siddiq, in which he gave everything for the Prophet. And then people asked, what have you left for yourself and your people? He said, I have left God and his Prophet. So that way he seemed to have the same kind of attitude in the sense that everything is there. If God and the Prophet are there, there's nothing missing. So Prophet ﷺ also said that the faith of Abu Bakr is on one side and all the faith of all the people in the world is on the other side. It will still weigh heavier on the side of Abu Bakr Siddiq. And also regarding the Futuwat you mentioned, regarding Futuwa, he was one of the leaders of Ukhuwat, I think. Akhi. In Arabic, it will be ukhuwat in the noun form, but akhi is the word that is used. Whatever it is, it's regarding the futuwat. And there's one verse from the Masnavi that came to mind regarding futuwat. I think that speaks to this Sheikh Husamuddin Chalabi is that Kay futuwat dadane bi illatast, pak bazi kharije har millatast. That is to give without any cause. Futuwat is to give without any like external cause. And Pakbazi, I don't know whether it's a game or gambling. It's
Mhm.
outside of all the predictabilities and calculated actions which other people may do. But this is an act of a person who's gambled his all and lost all and gained all, as they say, like all of that, like in the case of Shams. And he just gave up everything, including his reputation and all his great, like probably students and a large number of all the great prestige and power. So all these thread of giving all and that kind of thing seems very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Maulana says in Divan-e-Shams, خنکان قماربازی که بباخت آنچه بودش. Blessed is that gambler who lost everything that he had, and nothing remained with him except the desire to gamble one more time. So that's the lover of Allah. Gives everything for Allah, doesn't withhold anything. Because God is one. So you owe everything to Allah. Your mind, your time, your money, your possessions. So, it's a shirk, it's a hidden shirk. If you say, this is for myself, this is for Allah. This much for Allah, this much for myself. So everything is for Allah. Your entire being, your mind, your thoughts should be directed to Allah. Your feelings, your sentiments, your everything. So, man kana lillah, the one whose existence is for God. Kana Allah lah, and God is for him. Husamuddin was such a person. He was devoted. And exactly, Aflaki, when he mentions Husamuddin, he says Siddiq bar, exactly like Siddiq. So his devotion was like Siddiq.
Also, regarding you mentioned that he was a great listener, and that was his great gift, which drew out the Masnavi. So, also reminded of this description of the Prophet ﷺ as Uzunu Khair, Uzunu Khairil Lakum. He's just listening to everyone. I think in the Quran it's mentioned Uzunu Khairil Lakum. So he's the hearing, the ear of blessing. I mean, he's the one who heard the Quran, and then in the sense that it recalls, like Masnavi also is like the Quran in the Persian tongue, it's said.
So we talked about how the Masnavi began. Last time we talked about how Husamuddin asked Maulana to start this. Just like in our circle, we read the poetry of Sana'i and Attar. Why don't you start something like Sana'i's Hadiqatul Haqiqa or something like Attar's Mantuq al-Tayr? And Maulana had already thought about that, and he had written the first 18 verses of the Masnavi. But the first 18 verses of the Masnavi are the only verses of the Masnavi that Maulana took a pen and wrote. The rest of the Masnavi, Maulana dictated the Masnavi. And Husamuddin, and there were other scribes as well, but mainly Husamuddin, he would write them down. And many of these were in sessions. So there were sessions, there were people coming for the Masnavi sessions, and they were usually after the Isha prayer. And there were a mixed audience. So there were some students of religious sciences, but also common people, tradespeople, merchants, people from all walks of life attending these sessions. And sometimes in the Masnavi, it's an interactive text. So sometimes there's mention of the audience. So like Maulana says, oh, I feel like you're sleepy, right? The audience, the listeners are sleepy. And the water has taken the watermill. Or sometimes there would be food just distributed. And Maulana mentions again in the Masnavi. So there is that live interaction with the audience. So it's really unusual for a text where you have, that interaction with the audience. And there were other parts of the Masnavi where it's only Maulana and Husamuddin. And sometimes, and these are actually some of the deeper types of the parts of the Masnavi, sometimes it would take until dawn. So all night, it would be Maulana and Husamuddin sitting together, Maulana dictating and Husamuddin writing. And sometimes Maulana mentions that. He says, Sobh shud, ey sobh ra pushta panah. It's dawn, it's morning. And you're the pillar of morning. You're the essence of morning. Uzra makhtumi Husamuddin bekha. Pardon me. Pardons to my master Husamuddin. So all night, Maulana was dictating and Husamuddin was writing. And afterwards, Husamuddin would read the Masnavi back to Maulana. And Husamuddin also had a beautiful voice. So sometimes he would sing the verses of the Masnavi. And Maulana would sometimes add another bait where he would change or say this word instead of that word and so on. But Husamuddin was always there. And he says, Chun sar reshte be dast kam tost, because you hold the thread of thought within your hand. And you are the thread. So all these thoughts, they're like the pearls, but you're the string that keeps them all together. So that's what Maulana says about Husamuddin. And as we said, when Husamuddin left, so for after the completion of book 1, Husamuddin's wife died and Husamuddin was not there. Maulana stopped the Masnavi. And then the beginning of book 1, he says, Muddati in Masnavi ta'akhir shud. There was a delay in the Masnavi. You need time for blood to turn into milk. And then he says, because Husamuddin was away, without his spring, the buds could not open. Now, Masnavi is a very unusual book. So first of all, it's called Masnavi, and Masnavi is a genre. It's rhyming couplets, basically, in Persian. And in Persian and Arabic, Arabic has Masnavi as well. It's like Mathnawi in Arabic and Masnavi in Persian, like differences in pronunciation. But it's a type of poetry where every line has a separate rhyme. So it's like A, B, B, C, C, that kind of poetry. In general, that genre, that type of poetry is called Masnavi. But anytime someone says, I want to buy the Masnavi, or I want to read the Masnavi, it's the Masnavi of Maulana. So that generic name became specific. That's how important this book is. So, and in the beginning of the Arabic introduction, Maulana says, Hada kitabul Mathnawi. This is the Masnavi. وَهُوَ أُصُولَ 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 الدِّينِ. And this is the roots of the roots of the roots of religion. This is the fundamentals and the mysteries of attaining that reality, attaining that truth, and certainty, attaining certainty. وَهُوَ فِقْهُ اللَّهِ الْأَكْبَرِ. And this is the greater fiqh. So, you know, if you want law, this is the great. If you want understanding, this is the greater understanding. If you want theology, you know, theology was called usul ad-din. This is the usul ad-din. This is the roots of that, roots of theology. And it is a quite unusual book when it comes to how it's structured. So if you read other books, Sufi books, you read Imam Ghazali's Ihya Ulum ad-Din, there are chapters. There's a chapter on patience. There's a chapter on gratitude, chapter on repentance, chapter on... It has a structure. It has a beginning. It has an end. Every chapter has a theme. The chapter on patience, it's only about patience. The chapter on remembering God, it's only about remembering God. The chapter on death, it's only about death. It has a structure. But when you come to the Masnavi, it's a different story. Even Professor Nicholson, he translated the Masnavi and it took him so much of his time and effort, but he was saying this is tedious, this is disjointed, there are long digressions. So, and the reason is Maulana is telling a story. It's a story about, let's say, this king, and right in the middle of the story, just one word reminds him of something, and then one word, it's like faraq, right? The faraq of the parrot from India. And then there's a digression. Maulana goes into a hal. Are Shahnameh and Mantaq al-Tayr also Masnavi? Yes, they are indeed. Yes, Mantaq al-Tayr is Masnavi. Hadiqat al-Haqiqa is Masnavi. Shahnameh is Masnavi. It's a type of poetry that's suitable for narrative, usually for stories. So Layli and Majnun is Masnavi. Khusro and Shirin, there are hundreds of Masnavis in Persian. It's suitable for narrative and also for didactic poetry, whereas ghazals are mostly love poetry and qasidas are mostly for...
Just one more question. Is it normal in Masnavi that you have the main story, that's a flow going on, and then you have some side stories coming up? For example, I saw that in Mantaq al-Tayr that Fariduddin Attar is telling the story from one bird's perspective, then there comes some hikayat. and Maulana is also doing that. So I was wondering if it is normal in all Masnavis, or is it specific to these?
You know, in some Masnavis, you do have, to some extent, there's a story within a story, but in Maulana, that happens all the time. That happens all the time. So there's one story, and then right in the middle of that story, one image or one word triggers something in Maulana. And then there is this theological discussion or this insight. And then the story pauses. And then Maulana talks about free will and predestination, and then the nature of the self. And then there are some ecstatic verses on fana. And then there is a hadith. And then there's another story. And then Maulana says, "In sukhan payan nadara." These words do not have end. Let's go back to the original story, right? Something that you see in the Masnavi, it's not in, again, if you read Nizami again, Javiz, Layli, and Majnun, it's clear where the story ends, where the story, but with Maulana, it's not like that. And, you know, and that's why a lot of these translators and French or even Professor Nico, they complain that this is disjointed. Well, it's like complaining, why is the ocean not a swimming pool? You know, the ocean is the ocean. If you look at the night sky, the stars look disjointed, but there is a harmony. There is a harmony. It's just not, it's an inner harmony. It's like forest and a park. That park, everything's organized. But if you enter a forest, there's a lot of randomness. What appears as randomness, but there is that inner harmony. So Maulana says this is not a manual. The Masnavi is not a manual.
I just wanted to come back to this Masnavi topic that you are talking about, and it was very interesting for me because you mentioned that there were also ordinary people in the gatherings. And I think this also explains a little bit about the way Masnavi is directed towards the people. Maulana is not like a lot of poets who take pride in hiding things in complexity. Poets take pride in, I'm sure you also would have thought about it when you're writing poetry, that you want to hide a lot of things in small words. But what Maulana is doing sometimes is that when he starts explaining, then he tries to finish this hikayat, or what would I use the word for hikayat, like a story with a lesson or something like that. And he tries to spoon feed a little bit. And this makes a lot of sense. And the second thing is, I think it is also very natural for the human brain to not focus on the same thing for a long time.
Absolutely, yes. Allah. Allah. Yeah. So yes, some of these people who look down on the Masnavi. So Maulana says, they object to me. They say, "Kin sukhan past ast, yani Masnavi qissah paygambar ast o paygravi." They say this Masnavi is a lowly thing. It's a lowly book. It's the tale of the Prophet and paygravi and following. It's summed up in just the Prophet and following. Nist zikr bahs o asrar buland. You do not have high mysteries there. It does not hold discourses on mysteries. Ke davanand awliya anja samand. And the awliya ride their horses or their samand there in those heights. As maqamat tabattul ta fana, from the stations of tabattul, and that is weaning the soul of all its attachments until fana, nothingness. Paye paye ta mulaqat khuda, step by step until meeting with God. And with borders of every resting place, every maqam, every station. So these people complaining that Masnavi is a simple book. It contains stories about a turtle and a camel, and some stories about the prophets, and some stories about this handmaiden and the king and the parrot and the grocer and so on. This is simple. We need more methodological, more. They're complaining the Masnavi is not a manual. And Maulana says, you're right. The Masnavi is exactly that. It's not a manual. If you want manuals, there's Sufi manuals. There are other books. You can go and read. There's plenty. But this is another book. And Maulana says, just like when the Quran was revealed, when the Quran was revealed, they said the exact same thing. They said, this is asatir al-awwalin. This is just stories, ancient stories, fables, and tales. Where's the loft? Where's the depth? And Maulana says, no, if you want the depth, you need to read. You need to change the way you look at it, or to change the way you listen to it. You need to go deeper. You need to go deeper. Yes, on the surface level, کودکان خرد فهمش میکنند. Even little children understand it well, if it's just a surface level. But once you go to the deeper, it gets harder. And that's why the Quran says, گفت اگر آسان نماید این به تو, if this seems so easy to you and so light to you, این چنین آسان یکی سوره بگو. Say a chapter, a surah, just like this easy surahs. And it's not. Even if the jinn and the ins and the humankind and the spirits all come together, they cannot make a surah or like the Quran. So Maulana says this is not a manual. This is not a manual that has a beginning and an end. And the reason he mentions the Quran is because it's inspired by the Quran. And the structure is similar to the Quran. That's the only book it's similar to, it's the Quran in terms of structure. And that's why Abdul Rahman Jami, this great Sufi master, and he's in the Naqshbandi Tariqa from Herat, he says, من نمیگویم که آن عالی جناب هست پیغمبر ولی دارد کتاب. I do not say that this great man, referring to Maulana Rumi, I do not say that he is a prophet, but he has a book. مصنوی معنوی مولوی هست قرآن در زبان پهلوی. The spiritual Masnavi, or the spiritual couplets of Maulana Rumi, is the Quran in Persian tongue. As Quran dar zaban Pahlavi. And Allama Iqbal says the same thing. O be harf Pahlavi Quran nevesht. He wrote the Quran in the Pahlavi, or in the Persian language. And what that means is the meanings of the Quran are present in the Masnavi. So it's a different expression of the Quran in the Persian tongue. So, and yes, in the Masnavi, the sources of the Masnavi, obviously the first and foremost is the Quran. There's so many verses of the Quran that are quoted directly, and there are some that are quoted by meaning. And then second to that is hadith, the hadith literature. Obviously Maulana knew a lot of hadith, and also Qasas al-Anbiya. So it's Qasas al-Anbiya is a really, there's some Qasas al-Anbiya that come from the hadith or come from the Quran, but there's a lot that comes from ultimately from rabbinical literature, right, from Midrash, and then they were translated into Arabic. They became Islamicized in a sense. And also there are anecdotes and from Ghazali. There are many stories from Attar, from Sana'i. There's some from Kililo and Demne, that's in Indian. It's actually Panchatantra is the original. It comes from India, but it was again translated to Persian and to Arabic. And also some jokes, like the man from Qazwin that goes to get a tattoo. There's some jokes, ethnic jokes, things like that. So Maulana takes even those like jokes. And in book 6 of the Masnavi, there are a few stories that, and it's because again, you need to consider that Maulana had an audience, and that audience changed. So you might hear stories like that, and it reflects what the audience wanted to hear. But what's interesting is Maulana takes those stories and gives them a spiritual meaning. Nicholson says, Maulana borrows much but owes little. So yes, he borrows these stories from culture, he takes them from Kalila and Demna and so on, but he owes little because he gives them a new life, a new meaning, something that no one had ever thought about before. So when we think about the sources, we need to consider that.
Regarding the thing you mentioned, the similarity with the Quran, that brings some easy verses like the Quran, some easy verses like this. So Maulana says that. So this, I reminded of this term. I think it's a literary term in Arabic and Persian. Sahil al-Mumtani'. Means deceptively simple. It's to be simple, you have to have the simplicity on the other side of complexity. Somebody has mentioned that the simplicity on this side of complexity is there, on the other side of complexity is there. So this idea that simplicity that includes the complexity. And I think that is what Maulana, and obviously the Quran has so many layers of meaning, and somebody like Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi, from the letter, he takes so much. not by going by any kind of special like allegorical interpretation, but just the literal meaning itself is so rich. And so that is a Sahl al-Mumtani' is the kind of description of the Masnavi too that I think it fits. And one more thing is regarding the, you mentioned some of the stories in the sixth volume and some other stories. So I was thinking that this idea of high culture and the popular culture, this dichotomy that we have in the academia and everything, there is this people snobbish type of this thing that culture means it should be something that is high and it should be like accessible to people of learning and culture and so on. So this thing in India is a very common this thing. So the idea of Sanskrit, because Sanskritam means cultured or like refined, and there is something called, it is contrasted with what's called Prakrit, or Prakrit means like natural or raw or just what you can call earthy or something like that, like nature. The Prakriti means nature, so Prakrit means natural. So that is looked down upon, and this is in the context of, because the Buddhist scriptures and all came in Prakrit. The Sanskrit is the Vedic scriptures and all. So this idea that there's a lot of conflict between these two, although it can be reconciled at other levels, but obviously there is a conflict. And this idea about this Arab and Ajam is there, and Greeks and barbarians, all these things indicates this idea that looking down upon the common people. And this common idiom is considered to be like not fit for refined discourse. I think Maulana like conflicts or rather overcomes or bridges this gap. And like many folklore texts or folklore productions, I think in India and all, there are so many folklore from the tribes and other places where people, the spokesperson of that, like the oracle or the tribal, the person, whatever you might call the possessed soul, who just speaks out of his inspiration, whatever the idea of mania, which Plato mentioned earlier, this idea that you speak by inspiration. And that is considered, that's how folklore develops. So much folkloric texts, actually, we don't know who the author is even, because they were not concerned with actually claiming authority and claiming their novelty in that. So that is a mode of inspiration of the Masnavi that seems to be very interesting in that it bridges the gap between these categories that we have later made, especially these so-called philosophers, about which Maulana had very little respect for in the sense of those called academic philosophers. And so he actually was able to overcome that dichotomy and produce a text which everyone can relate with. And the highest is there. And obviously some, what you can say, material that Nicholson translate did not even write in English. He used Latin to write it because he was shy to write it in English. Even that is there in the Masnavi.
Indeed, indeed. And yeah, Maulana is talking to every class of people. So, and you need different fishing nets to capture different types of fish. There are some stories that Nicholson translates in Latin because they are explicit and so on, but he's using that as a fishing net to capture souls.
What I wanted to say is that even I wouldn't denigrate a story, a narrative, because sometimes that in a very beautiful way can make a point a long argument maybe cannot. And when I used to teach, I could, for example, explain what free will is, and my students would write down very dedicated notes about the philosophical argument about what is free will, but they would never read it again. But I'm almost 6 feet tall for those barbarians who live in a non-metric system, or 1 meter 82. So I'm a very tall person. So I would say to my students, but when I was a child, I wanted to be a ballet dancer. And I point to my body, the idea that I would ever be a ballet dancer, completely ludicrous. And they would all laugh. And so I think years later, when they think of the concept of free will, they will never think of the philosophical argument for that, but they will think of me pointing to my body, being a tall person, that I could never be a ballet dancer. So I think it's saying the same thing in a different way. And also, I think making people laugh. It's like sugar in the spoon, taking the lesson with sugar, and it stays with people. So that's my experience.
Absolutely. And that's why Maulana says, if words were enough, God would not create heavens and the earth. But that's a revelation, God, yes, reveals books and reveals the Quran, reveals the Gospels and so on. But he also made the stars and the trees and the rivers and the mountains. That's also a type of revelation. So there is a resonance between those two. So why? Because that mountain shows it's an example of some aspect, or it's a sign of Allah. Maulana says, "Kudakan afsane ha miavarand." The children tell their children's stories. Darsh dar afsanashon sad fikr pand, but there's wisdom in those stories, in those fables, and especially someone who has that spiritual inclination finds spiritual meaning in everything.
Just regarding what Sister Leslie was saying regarding humor, I think that's a very major thread or a component of Maulana's discourse, I think, in the Masnavi. So khande is a very common word that is khandidam and khandeyam. Khande is like, I think, laughter and humor. Like so much laughter and humor, I think, made that text so light in so many different. Light has two meanings. Light is like not heavy, but also light and darkness, that meaning. So it's such as that lightness of Maulana is apparent in the words, that the playfulness with which he just is willing to play with things that are generally were very serious, like people with regard to the theological concepts. So the play that is apparent in his work, I think it's that a characteristic that has made it so popular and so relatable. And the element of playfulness. Fatima Keshavar, I think, makes that same main point in her study called as reading mystical lyric about, I think, about Divan, that the playfulness which he has in that, which makes those poems, and I think in the Masnavi too, it is apparent, but to a lesser degree possibly. But that is what makes it like captivating and so like addictive, maybe, for people who really enjoy that. So it just intoxicates, and I think that may explain some of its enduring appeal.
I just wanted to say about laughter. I think in all religion or spiritual ways, laughter is just so important. It's not just one way to remember something, but because the spiritual way is uplifting, and there's no more uplifting than a smile and laughter. Unfortunately, I see Islam has become, or is being practiced in such a gloomy way these days, which you can't smile or laugh anymore, and I find it very disheartening.
It reminded me of what Maulana says about, and because it was Eid a couple of days ago, Ismail, right? He says, and Maulana sometimes uses Ishaq, Isaac, sometimes Ishmael, and in Islamic tradition, you have both. You have both options. You have both opinions. And ultimately, it's surrender. He says, and done. So surrender joyfully, surrender with happiness. And if you go to the linguistics of it, Ismail comes from listening, and Ishmael in Hebrew. And Isaac comes from laughter. Isaac, the literal meaning is laughter. So you listen to God, you surrender, but you do it happily, you do it joyfully. That's the essence of Islam, right? And Maulana has a ghazal on fasting. He says, Dar siyam panehi shadi konanne bagushad. If you want to fast, Ramadan or other than Ramadan, if you want to fast, fast joyfully, with happiness, with expansion. چون حرام است, this part is interesting. حرام است و نشاید همچو غمناکان صیام, because it's haram for Maulana. It's unlawful to fast with sadness, right?
Yeah, I think Kharakani has some similar verses also. Kharakani, I think. Yeah, wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, Allah. So yes, there are people who fast, but they're grumpy. They're complaining. That for Maulana is unlawful.
Yeah, just regarding Ishaq, it comes from the Yalhaq, Yalhaku, Lahika, Yalhaku. That is in that probably pre-Arabic, probably Aramaic, or all those pre-Arabic languages which is spoken by Ibrahim alayhi salam, or those things. So Yalhaku and Ilhaq, probably the noun form of that. No, I was just thinking that there is this hadith which says that, I don't remember the hadith. The Prophet said to his companions, Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam said to his companions that to a certain group of, God will disclose himself to them laughing. God will disclose himself to them laughing. So yatajallallahu lahikan. That is the Arabic word. So the companions, the Sahaba were a little shocked. God laughing. Does God ever laugh? Is it a laughing God? Does God laugh? So yeah, the Prophet said, definitely, that's what I said. So it means that the Prophet's words are words that come right from the horse's mouth, or whatever is the exact words that are the best words that can be spoken about any particular thing. So he said, yes, that's exactly true. So then the companions said, then we are very hopeful of a God that laughs. We didn't think that this idea that the old man in the sky, the grumpy old man in the sky, the kind of God that is probably the caricature of the God against which somebody like Sigmund Freud, the psychologists, actually called it a kind of the father who's strict, the old man in the sky. But this is a different God. This is a God of laughter and the God of joy and the God of beauty and the God of love. So Maulana actually manifests that aspect of God so beautifully, and hence we can't help but laugh at some of his words.
SubhanAllah, I was thinking also about dark humor, because the spiritual path actually includes laughing at not just at things that are actually funny, but at the absurdities of life, and like how silly some things are, like how silly it is that we take. I think, is it from Mevlana, the one that where he says, death comes, and then you laugh, waking up at what you thought it was your grief. And just like this whole life it's kind of a joke that we take it so seriously, where it's not supposed to be taken seriously. So with Ishaq, I don't know the exact etymology, but I think it's because his mother laughed. فضحكت. She laughed at the joke. I think it was for her, it was also a kind of dark humor laugh. Oh, I'm such an old lady, and my husband is, what now? Now we're gonna have a baby. That's hilarious. And I think that's so beautiful that Allah didn't take that as offensive, because I kind of personification that Ashraf was speaking about of God, we think, oh, God takes offense, God is to be terrified, and we should be terrified of God. God's power is terrifying, and Allah does say, وَإِيَّايَ فَارْهَبُونَ, be terrified only of me. But at the same time, it's so beautiful that when she laughed in the face of the angels, giving her the news, they just gave her good news. So yeah, subhanAllah. The other thing was, even I think in the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it is that Allah laughs looking at a person who's miserable, and He laughs knowing that their faraj, what's faraj? Their opening, I guess, or their relief is close. So that's also an interesting thing to laugh at. In terms of the names of Allah, this relates to Allah's name Al-Latif. And in Urdu, we call jokes Latifa. And it's really interesting because when someone's really funny, they have to have lutf in them. They have to have, and lutf not as in gentleness, because Latif is an impossible name to translate, as is every name of Allah impossible to translate. But especially lutf is impossible to translate. But here I would mean it like subtlety. And what you guys might laugh at, some other people might find extremely disrespectful. And even like you was speaking about how he said, come to my, what's it called? I mean, even calling it urs, come to my funeral with music and all of that. Some people might not find that funny. They find it really offensive. Like, you're supposed to be somber and sad at a funeral. So it's like the lutf of knowing what makes, and lutf and khabr, right? So it's like both of them, because Allah says, وَهُوَ اللَّطِيفُ الْخَبِيرُ. He's actually in tune with every single specific thing of like the subtlety. And so there's like so much subtle knowledge or experience that you need to have in order to make a joke. And then in order to make a joke that will land with that specific audience. And only then you can actually be funny. Funniness is it's a manifestation of Allah's names, Lutf and Khabr. And so it's an actually expertise. It's not something that everybody even has.
I was just reminded of a verse from Iqbal in Urdu. I'll just say that. I think it speaks to what Zinira was saying. The fool ki pe asar. The fool ki pati. You can even cut a diamond with a petal of a flower or a rose. But kalame par marde nada par kalame narma nazuk be asar. For the people without understanding, without a sense of humor or sense of what he calls sahridayatum in Sanskrit, that's a heart. The person with a alive heart. Without that, that's the artist is a person with an alive heart. In general, the experience, the person who enjoys art also requires a kind of a heart. So without that heart, without that understanding, kalame narmo nazuk beasar. Any points or humorous points would be of beasar. There wouldn't be any this thing. So narmo nazuk is said, no, because this idea of narm in Malayalam and in Sanskrit too, the word for jokes is narmam. Narmam means what as in Nira was saying regarding latifa, that's the same. In Sanskrit, that's a Sanskrit. This is Perso-Arabic, but this is narmam means actually the same as latifa in a sense. That soft, that subtle, which is only has an effect on people who have that kind of affinity for that. Otherwise, it is just a bayasar. So that came to mind. And one more thing came to mind regarding the names of God and the manifestations of that. There is this anecdote which I've read. I don't know whether it's in the Masnavi. I don't think so. But this idea that the example of Prophet Isa alayhi salam and Yahya alayhi salam, they were cousins. And they had very different temperaments, according to this particular folkloric story. So they met each other occasionally while they're in their walks and travels. So at one point, so generally Yahya alayhi salam was a very somber, serious person, always given to tears and grave and serious most of the time. And while Isa alayhi salam was always smiling and his face was always shining with a smile and laughter. So when they met each other, Yahya alayhi salam asked, it seems, in the story to Isa alayhi salam, why are you laughing like this? Have you not heard about the grandeur, the tremendousness of God? The Jalal of God. Have you not heard God as Al-Jabbar, Al-Mutakabbir, Al-Qahar, or whatever the names that come to mind? So, but then how can you just be relaxed? So then Isa alayhi salam asked the question in return, have you not heard, oh Yahya, have you not even heard of the Rahman, that unlimited mercy? His names as Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, Al-Wadud, and all those names. But so then this is idea of these are different aspects of the idea of Jalal and Jamal and Kamal and all come to mind there. This idea that who's better than this? And inna rahmati taghlibu ghalabi, it is said in the on the arsh it is written that rahmati taghlibu ghalabi, inna rahmati taghlibu ghalabi. So the whole idea that there is something here, being is a mercy. It's from God's divine mercy and overflowing mercy that we are actually here, or there is anything at all present, being itself. So that way it is God's mercy and God's beautiful names that, or rather the names of beauty that trump in the end. So that I think comes through in a work like Maulana's Masnavi, where it is the overflowing of beauty. Like the fear is there, but that fear is just trumped, and hope as just triumphant over fear, I think. Although fear is there, fear has its place, no doubt about that.
One of my teachers was saying that Musa alayhi salam, he's a manifestation of Allah's Jalal. He was very quick to get angry, and he did quite a few things that some people might find problematic. Like he just threw the tablets that Allah gave him, and he grabbed his brother by his beard. And yeah, anyways, he was a manifestation of Allah's Jalal. And then if we just look at it like in terms of like spiritual evolution, maybe that is what his people needed. First of all, there's various reasons for why he would even end up being like that. Of course, he's a manifestation of Allah's Jalal and Quwwah. He's very strong physically. Ibn Arabi says it's because all the boys that were killed for being Musa, like all the boys Firaun and his people killed, they killed because he had this prophecy that a boy from Bani Israel is going to grow up and defeat Firaun. So he killed them because he thought they would be Musa. So Ibn Arabi, Sheikh al-Akbar, says that because of that, all of their spirits came in to support Musa alayhi salam. So he was really physically strong. And that's why he ended up accidentally killing someone. So anyway, so he's a manifestation of Allah's Jalal. And one of the reasons would also be because he was raised by the Firaun, and the Firaun was a very narcissistic person. And because when we read the Quran, when you see the amount of problematic things that his qawm did, that Allah preserved for us to even know of all these years until the rest of time, is that they needed that Jalal. Because in one way, prophets are teachers, and some students only learn with a Jalali manifestation, and some students only learn with a Jamali manifestation. And as a teacher, you have to have the lutf to know which one needs which one. And so after that, Isa alayhi salam comes, and one of my teachers said that he's a very Jamali manifestation of Allah. It's like, turn the other cheek, like that kind of teaching from the Bible. But also someone said, one of my teachers said that his Isa alayhi salam's mirror was really pure, and he was a really Jamali manifestation. That is why when people looked at him, they thought he was God. And then of course Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam comes, and he's the perfect, he's the Kamil. And so he is Jalali and Jamali. He's always smiling. But when he gets angry, his face turns red. So subhanAllah, it's like there's a prophet for everything, or there's a teacher, or there's a being that you can tune into, which whenever you need, like whichever type of student needs to learn, Allah sent something relevant to that, which is also Allah's lutf again.
I just wanted to share a joke told to me by a psychiatric patient who was in mania. Mania is a state when people are very lively and they sing and they dance. So this man told me, he's from a Muslim background, and I thought it just summarizes the discussion beautifully in a very witty way, I thought. So he said that I follow the path of Jesus, he told. So he's from a Muslim background. He said that was itself a very unusual statement. So he said, I follow the path of Jesus. If somebody slaps me on one cheek, I'll turn the other cheek. But if he slaps me on that cheek, then that's the end of his life. So after that, it is Moses. First, I follow Jesus. I gave 2 chances to him. And then Moses, one slap from Moses would be the end of that person. So I follow the path of Moses after that. So I think that expressed the wisdom. For example, in Quran, it's mentioned that Amarna mutrafiha fa fasaku fiha fa hakka alayha al-qawlu fa dammarnaha tadmira. So that the time comes when the rope is, like, give a long rope to people, but then when the time comes, that's the end of it. So that wisdom was expressed by him in a beautiful, spontaneously funny, but also I think a very pithy statement.
So yeah, we could talk about Maulana's other works. So Divan-e-Shams, let's talk a little bit about Divan-e-Shams. So yes, Divan-e-Shams, as Divan, it's basically in Persian and Arabic, it's a collection of poems by a poet. Now, what is unusual is Maulana did not sign at the end of poems. Usually the poet signs his poems. So Hafiz signs his poems, Hafiz. Sa'di signs his poems, Hafiz, Sa'di. But Maulana, so at the end of his poems, so, you know, where you have the takhallus or the pen name of the poet, so he mentions Shams al-Tabrizi. And that's why, one reason why this book became famous as Divan-e-Shams. So Shams himself did not write poetry. This is Maulana's poetry. But he signs Shams. And also sometimes he mentions others like Salahuddin, or he mentions Husamuddin. Or sometimes he ends with a call to silence. So sometimes he will just say khamoosh or khamoosh, be silent, or generally a call to silence. And usually from the signature, you can tell if this ghazal is early. So the Shams poems, the Shams ghazals are earlier, and the Salahuddin ghazals are in the middle, and Husamuddin ghazals are at the end. Khamoosh, we can't be quite sure, but it might be something that he used throughout. So these ghazals were throughout a period. So some of them are earlier, some of them are a bit later. And Maulana, more than any other poet, used poetic meters. So there were poets who used 15 meters or 10 meters or 20 meters. Maulana used over 50 different meters. And it's interesting in the Turkish manuscripts because they were used for sama. So they arranged the divan, they arranged the poems based on the meter. So the poetic manuscripts in Turkey, they're all based on meter. So all the poems in this meter and then all the poems in that meter. Whereas the Persian manuscripts, they're based on the last letter, on the last letter of each bait, so that it's easier to find a particular bait. So they're more alphabetical. There are roughly 3,000, 3,500, up to 3,700 ghazals, and around 2,000 ruba'is or quatrains in the divan. And a lot of them have this musical quality, which again, no other divan has, because they were used for sama, they were used for music sessions. So like Murde Budam, Zinde Shodam, they have that quick rhythm that is the rhythm of the dance. And again, just like any other work by Maulana, Maulana did not sit behind a desk to write them. They were spontaneous, oftentimes in sessions of sama. And the scribes would frantically write everything down, and then they were collected. The language is varied. So again, Maulana uses the language of the elite. There is some beautiful Arabic ghazals or Persian ghazals where he uses high language, like because Maulana had read the poetry of, let's say, Nizami or the poetry of Unsuri and Anvari and Khaqani and so on. So there are some poems where he uses that high language, but they're also everyday language, words that everyday people use in Konya. So Maulana is in touch with all classes of the society. So he uses that too. And again, because Konya is a multicultural society, so there are Arabs, there are Persians, there are Armenians, there are Turks, there are Greek-speaking people. So there are some macaronic verses. So half of the bait is in Arabic, the other half is in Persian. Or you have one ghazal, for example, it's in 4 languages. It's in Greek, in Turkish, and Arabic, and Persian. So he uses different languages too. And it's very different from the Masnavi. So in the Masnavi, it's more like a torch. It's more like a lantern. In Divan, you have the fire. You have the fire of love. You have the fire that burns. That's sukhtamu, sukhtamu, sukhtamu. I burned and I burned and I burned. That's what you see in the Divan. The Divan is mainly an invitation. So Masnavi, it's bishnu. Listen. Listen. But Divan, it's all about biya. Come and experience this. And probably that's why Maulana ends many of his ghazals with khamush. Because the rest cannot be said with words. Not everything has to be said. The rest you have to come and experience. You have to come and taste it yourself, and then you will know. So that's another reason why Maulana uses khamush as one of his signatures. And Maulana says none of this poetry is the result of my own effort or my own cleverness or my own knowledge. Do not suppose that I am the one who is thinking these poems. So long as I am awake and I am conscious, I don't say anything. I don't write anything. So all these poems, they're not coming from the flute, they're coming from the flute player. What have I to do with poetry? But the flute player is breathing into me. And that's where the music comes.
Yes. Yeah, regarding the meters, I wanted to ask something. So you said it's a lot of meters, different meters are there in the Divan. And Masnavi has just 1 meter. I think it's called Ramal Musaddas. So this idea that you mentioned that thing. So I was thinking that I was generally, whenever I hear Masnavi being recited, I find that only it becomes like it is most attractive and easy to understand when that is recited in that meter. But some of these musicians, they just extend some of the syllables, and then instead of adding beauty to it, I have found that it makes it difficult to understand, as well as it takes away from its beauty. I do not know. I thought you might have a comment on that, especially regarding the Masnavi meter. If it is sung in a very long, it's a bit like the Quran. Now, the Quran has this tajweed and it's a proper rhythm, and it's beautiful in that way. But if you want to extend all that mud and all that, if you just according to arbitrary notions of beauty, then it becomes less beautiful.
Absolutely. What Persians do to Arabic, Turks do to Persian. So elongate the vowels so much that the meaning becomes unclear. That's sometimes what happens with Masnavi Khans. When they read Maulana's poetry, they elongate it too much so that you don't even hear the word.
Just one more thing regarding, you mentioned that Maulana has repeatedly mentioned that it's not me consciously who is just singing, or rather producing the verses of the Masnavi or the Divan. So I just was reminded of an anecdote from one of the biographies of Muhammad Iqbal. I think it's not an official biography. It is somebody, like, many things were told by his servant and all, recorded by many people in unofficially and all. So this is probably in one of those. But I thought it was very interesting in that Allama Iqbal was a person who was very learned. He studied at Cambridge. He did his PhD at Germany, Munich. So he was a prodigiously learned person. He was a philosopher as well. His philosophical lectures, Reconstruction is a very philosophical lectures. So one of his philosophical colleagues, I think, told him that all that you say we can understand and accept, because you're a very intelligent person and you make a lot of sense. But how can you really believe that somebody in Arabia, just out of the Bedouin Arabs, or rather uncultured Arabs, could just produce out of his own mouth a text like the Quran? How is it even possible? How can you believe it? Of all the logic that I can apply, I cannot accept it. Like, how is it possible for a person like that? Because they don't accept inspiration by God. No, it's not prophecy they can't accept. But as a scholar, like, how is it possible for such a text as this to come out of a illiterate person? I meaning the Prophet. So the answer Iqbal gave, I thought was very interesting, is that he said that on the contrary, from my personal experience, I can 100% vouch for the fact that it is inspiration, because it happens to me as well. Because when poetic inspiration seizes me, and I mean, it happens to me, and I produce verses upon verses, hundreds of verses sometimes, and only later I write it down. So this happens to me. And if it has happened to me, my poetic inspiration of that kind, that it just comes, and then I later transcribe it or write it. So I think this is also, it's also significant that in his Asrar-e Khudi, I think he mentions or somewhere that Maulana came to him in a dream and gave him that inspiration. It was a dream contact in the imaginal, whatever, the barzakhi or imaginal contact in the inspiration that he keeps on saying about Maulana and his inspiration and how he made this clay into this, my clay into all these jalbas and these manifestations and tajallis came from. So that connection and also his own personal experience was, I think, the Maulana's sparks still into the 20th century are still burning people, and that burning is still going on.
Absolutely. And, Nizami Ganjali says, Parde razi ke sukhan parvarist, this music of secrets, that's poetry. Saye as Johar Peygambarist, it's a shadow of prophethood. And then he says, Nizami Ganjali says, Dil har ke ra ku sukhan gustarast, surushi surayande yari garast. There's an angel, there are angels of poetry that help poets. As an pishtar kan sukhanhay naqs, when before I sang those beautiful poems, there was this angel of poetry, Greeks call it muse, right? Hidden surush, ke ba man sukhanhay pushide goft, that was dictating these poems in secret. Konun an surayande khamosh gasht. Now that muse is silent. That muse is silent. Mara niz goftan faramosh gasht. And I forgot how to write poetry. I forgot poetry. So it's not the poet. Nizami Ganjali realizes it's not me.
Yeah, like in terms of if the angel, for example, comes, right? And then poetry or inspired poetry, not all poets write poetry. It's clear. Some people are just writing, like rehashing their own trauma or like using art as catharsis, which is fine. It's very useful. And but a lot of, yeah, like only very special poets like Mevlana and Allama Iqbal can be told, or you can even sense it. Just sometimes I just look at how much poetry Allama Iqbal has written, and it's insane. But yeah, so subhanAllah. Anyway, this metaphor of, I don't want to say metaphor, but yeah, it's a kind of sama, right? It's like, because when I was thinking about when you said that he says at the end, sometimes he signs off saying khamosh, and it's like he heard, and he's saying, I did not breathe a word of this poetry. So it's like he heard these words, and then he's telling us these words. If we look at the reed flute, then it's like this image of a channel being empty in order to hear it, and then to let something flow through you. And when, I don't know if it is from Mevlana, but I've just seen it in one of these quotes, if you are not silent, how will you hear? That's probably why he says khamosh. I imagine it would also be like encouraging the listener or the reader of the poetry to tune into that same place that he was in when he wrote that, or like when that came to him. And from Iqbal, it reminded me of a share from Iqbal. It says, Muhammad bhi tera, Jibreel bhi Quran bhi tera, ye harf sheerin tarjuma tera hai ya mera. He says Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is yours, Jibreel is yours, and the Quran is yours with a capital Y. But this harf sheerin, this beautiful letter, is it yours or mine? But he says tarjuman, which means translator also. But it's almost like the poet is not a speaker, he's a translator. And you need to hear the poet, these poets specifically, not all poets, but inspired poets, they're listening to something that is coming to them. And that is, I think, the actual difference between poets and the Prophet ﷺ is he's not a tarjuman, he's just listening and conveying it the way that it is, because his mirror and his channel is completely pure to the level that no human beings will ever be. Whereas us, because of us not being a prophet and also not being him specifically, there's a bit of nafs, like maybe our reed isn't completely empty, and so like we translate it in the words best that we understand, and that is also beautiful in its own way, because then it's a reflection of our nafs as well. But that's the difference also between the Quran and inspired poetry, is that there's no reflection of Rasulullah's nafs in the Quran, but there is a reflection of Mevlana or Alam Iqbal in his poetry. And also, in one way, that is special because this poetry is from a human being, in terms of that it's from a fallible person. And sometimes, like someone wrote that. I was in a class actually about why some people. There was a story about, I don't know if he was a Sufi or some person. He heard the Quran being read, but he didn't, like, he wasn't moved by it. And then he heard, I think, some poetry, and he started crying. And then they said, what was that? And he said, oh, actually, because this is the divine word. And actually, like, basically the implication was that the theological argument that actually sometimes you need a fallible person, because you are a human being, you're a fallible person, you're not the creator. And the creator does not go through some of the things, not some, many of the things that we go through, right? Such as death, such as loss. Allah does not lose anything. And so for us, in order to be able to have that access to the fallibility of the poet, that, oh, this poet is actually someone, like, for example, Shams is someone, Mevlana is someone who went through immense grief. God does not go through that. So that is why we relate, in a way, to his human side and his humanity in a way that God does not experience.
Yes, so there are different levels of inspiration or different levels of revelation. And it's interesting, like Wahy. In theological language, only prophets receive Wahy in theology. But if you look at the Quran says we reveal this to the bee. Even a bee can receive inspiration from God. We reveal this to the mother of Moses. So there are different levels of inspiration. And yes, you have the Quran, that's one level of inspiration. You have the Hadith, it's not the Quran, it's still inspired, but it's a different level of inspiration. And then you have inspired poetry. Again, it's a different level of inspiration.
I was going to say that from Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam receiving the Quran, that is something that nobody has access to. And so the Quran does not have any sort of tinge or tint of human word. He's a pure, clear reed flute, and the entirety of it came entirely from God without any of his nafs. But what does come, I don't want to say poetry because Allah does not like to call Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam a sha'ir. But what does come through inspired in him is Hadith Qudsi. And so it's like so I think he's a tarjuman of the Hadith Qudsi. He's a translator of the Hadith Qudsi. So he listens to the general energy of it, and then he translates it in his own words. And of course, Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam said, I was given the Jawami al-Kalim. So it's really high, because when we speak about art, right? The only artists, as far as I know, from the mention in the Quran or the shu'ara of shi'r, is used in a word. For example, in Surah Baqarah, Allah says, so shi'r is not just poetry, but it is consciousness. And Allah denigrates, like, he criticizes people who do not yash'urun. So that means the shi'r has access to a level of consciousness that Allah finds praiseworthy.
Nizami Ganjavi says, She'ru, Shar'u, Arsh as ham khastand. You have poetry and the throne and the Shara, and they're all together. And the world became beautiful because of these three. And poetry that takes you heavenward, it comes from heaven as well. It comes from God. Nizami Ganjavi is playing with the word. So She'r is poetry, and then Arsh is the throne of God, and Shara is the law. So there is the harmony in the law and the harmony in poetry, and the Arsh, the throne of God. So the world became beautiful because of these three. And they all have the same letters, the same three letters in Arabic, Shin and Ra and I.
Just regarding the different inspirations of poets, I was thinking you mentioned that angel of poetry came to Nizami Ganjavi mentioned regarding the angel. So I think Zinnira was mentioning regarding some of the poets who actually rehash their internal trauma and they just produce that kind of as a therapy, some form of expressive therapies are there. So I was thinking that the inspiration, the angel is one level of inspiration, the jinn as another level of inspiration, and then the human mental state is actually a jinn, according to Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi says, the human, what you call psychic structure is actually similar to a jinn. So this idea of the jinn inspiration, and Sha'irun aw Majnoon and all, it's mentioned in the Quran too. This idea of jinn possession, jinn inspiring, and the angelic inspiration, and then obviously the archangelic inspiration and all, we have to put it as a Jibril, and the other angels are not also alike. And Jibril is called the Ruhul Amin. and then these other angels are there. So maybe the poets are inspired by some angels, and then there are others who are inspired by the jinn, and others who are inspired by their own internal jinn-like faculties, which are just in a state of feariness, because jinn are made of fire and angels are made of light. They produce a lot of heat without light. So many poems, actually, Maulana's poetry has actually light. So Noor, 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 and all he says in other contexts. So this is light upon light upon light. But then there are other poems that are fire. Although fire has a meaning of light as well. Maulana says that Atashastin, Banganai, and all that the fire actually is light only. Because, for example, the burning bush and Moses and all we see. But that Noor and Nar are two aspects of the fire. You might say that the horizontal aspect is Nar and the vertical aspect can be seen as Noor. And so it is that people who are inspired, poets who take the light and who produce and who give light, and the others produce light mixed with admixtures of heat. Probably the mixtures, various mixtures, like for example, some amount of, even in Maulana and Iqbal and other great poets also, there is some heat, no doubt, and light together. Otherwise, we won't be finding it relatable. But it's light that predominates. And then other poets who heat predominates. And then fire in a negative sense. So I thought that is one way of looking at poetic inspiration, which is fruitful from the scriptural perspective too. And then regarding Wahy, you mentioned, Maulana mentions about Wahy Dil Goyan. So that's why we say that, so that people don't take any unnecessary meanings. So this idea of Wahy is actually a very, I don't want to go into the controversy, but still this idea of Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi and all said about the Nubuwa Mutlaka, this idea that there is a kind of communication still open with God. God still communicates, not with the Nubuwa Mashru'a, or rather the Sharia's, new Sharia will not come. So this is the one that actually was, I think, misinterpreted by someone like Mirza Ghulam Ahmad Qadian. And there's an interesting this thing, because people can claim that they are being inspired. This claim, everyone who is having some kind of poetic inspiration can claim then that I'm being inspired by it's a type of nubuwa mutlaka, or whatever Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi said. So I think it's an interesting ambiguity. And Iqbal mentions in his book about Qadianis that Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi should not have said that. That was one bit too far, in the sense that if you say things like this, people are going to misuse it. He had the authority to say it probably. But other than that, Maulana was very careful to say that it's Wahy Dil. And so there are dangers, I think, of people with kind of grandiose ideas of their self-importance can claim to be inspired by high inspiration. So the greatestly inspired people say that I am not the speaker. But there are others who might just, their feet may slip and they might end up in, instead of the light, they may end up in the fire, so to speak.
Maulana says, as paye rupush ame, because the general public, they cannot understand this. And that's why the Sufis call this Wahy Dil. They call this is inspiration from the heart. Where he says, yes, Sayyidina Rasulullah, he is the Khatm Nubuwwat, he's this seal of the prophets. There's no prophet after him. But God is still God. God speaks. And there are those who hear speak. So there are those who have that direct communication. There are those who have that direct communication. Now, you know, prophethood, it can have different meanings. Let's say in Judaism, you have Prophet Moses, Sayyidina Musa, who brought the laws, who brought the structure of the religion. But you also had people who reminded people of the message of Moses. There's Jeremiah and others. Reminded people of the essence. What is the essence of that religion? What is the core? What is the root? And those people, back then, they were called prophets. Now, because Sayyidina Rasulullah is Khatam al-Nabiyyin, we don't call anyone after him. We don't call them prophets. But again, as the hadith says, there are people who have knowledge in my ummah who are like Anbiya Bani Israel, who are like the prophets of old. It means they have inspired knowledge. They have ilm min ladun. They have direct knowledge. Now, we don't call them prophets, but they have something like that. They have prophetic knowledge. And that's why it says like the prophets of Bani Israel, like the prophets of old. And they readapt that message of the prophets. Why is it that it's still, you know, because there are people who adapt that message in different languages, different times, different places, just like Maulana did and others did in different times and different places. There has to be, again, there has to be a tarjuman to interpret that in a same wine in a new cup, in a new garment.
There is this category, I think, a controversial category called muhaddathun, those who are spoken to. And I think the example of and Nifari also comes to mind, which we came in our discussion chat. So he spoke directly to God, and God is speaking to him. And the sense that it's something that's why it is probably one of the texts that are very rare and in a sense like not easy at all of access and disorienting in its nature. So here he was spoken to. That seems to be one of those categories of inspiration which are ambiguous and would be liable to misinterpretation.
We've got Fihi Ma Fihi, and then Majalis al-Sab'id, the 7 sermons, and Maktubat, the letters of Maulana. So we'll go through those, inshallah, next week. There will be 6 sessions, perhaps like the 6 books of the Masnavi. We have 6 sessions on the life and works of Maulana, and also on Maulana's passing. So we'll, inshallah, go through them next week. And Maulana's legacy, so Maulana's living legacy, the students and the souls that he nurtured, people like Husamuddin, Chalabi, and Sultan Walad. So, inshallah, we'll talk about that next week.
Just one thing I wanted to say, but I left out regarding this idea of poetic inspiration. One thing, another thing came to mind is that khayal, imagination, one of the key words in Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi's works, which William Chittick has actually made that point. I thought what was interesting in this context of poetic inspiration is that it has been divided into 2. Is that al-khayal al-muttasil and al-khayal al-munfasil. Means that contiguous imagination and discontiguous imagination. This is the translation by William Chittick. The idea that this production of or poetry or say inspired work. So this khayal al-muttasil means that it is connected to the subject. Subjective aspect is there in that. You can call that nafs or our constitution or our psychophysical whatever peculiarities. But al-khayal al-muttasil, munfasil, the discontiguous imagination is something more objective than subjective, or rather purely objective even. This idea of there is that angels and there are these the visionary space in which Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi and all other great people have mentioned, meeting people and meeting other great people and then conversing with them. And this idea that maybe it is in that domain where angels and the prophetic inspiration and also the inspiration of the greatest of saints, the greatest of the awliya probably, and this idea that Arlullahil Wasi'a also he connects that to this, the God's wide earth, this idea that the earth that we have is a small earth in the sense it's not the earth that is God's wide earth, which is more beyond. So this al-khayal al-munfasil and al-khayal al-muttasil for the poetic inspiration and khayal al-munfasil for that supra-poetic or the greatest saintly or the awliya's discourse seems interesting as a kind of explanatory paradigm.
Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallim taslima. We send our love to the crown of all creation, Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, the one whose light gives birth to all saints. And we come to you, Ya Allah, with the broom of La ilaha illallah to sweep us away and to shatter all idols, all false idols of selfhood, of our attachments. And we're just like that reed cut from the reed bed. Ya Allah, that pain of separation is within every man and woman. In this desert of this world, our roots are in you. Our heart is you, and we're thirsty for you. We're carrying jugs to the ocean, Betty. We're carrying our jugs to the ocean, as Maulana says. Ya Allah, shatter this jug so that we're drowned in your ocean, so that nothing remains but the ocean. And throw us into this fire of love that has the light and the warmth. And may we listen. May we become people who listen. Vishnu. Ya Allah, I've talked too much, and the mystery is beyond what can be said and what can be expressed. We're all from silence. We go back to silence. Khamush. So let us go back to that silence where you speak. Walhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen.